Well, actually, I wrote the first 3 chapters and sent them off to a publisher. I told them in my cover letter that the novel was called Draugr, which means ghost in Icelandic, and I would submit the whole book the moment I heard from them. I felt safe in this claim because it usually takes a publisher 6 months to a year to reply. I'd have the book done by then. Orca Books wrote back 3 weeks later, saying they wanted to see the entire manuscript as soon as possible. I replied that I had to tweak the novel a little bit. And in the space of 2 months, I spent every hour possible writing the book and sent it off, fingers crossed. They accepted it, and finally I became a published novelist. It had been a long journey. Over 13 years of writing and rewriting, publishing articles, short stories, and poems, polishing and submitting 6 novels over and over and over again. Then the one that gets published is a children's novel that I dashed off in less than 3 months. Was it getting easier? Had I finally found the secret to the easy life? No. I was just lucky, as it turned out, because the next book in the series took a year due to massive rewrites. The 3rd book required yet another year. But I had crossed that border into the magical realm of being a published novelist, and the first book was a success, selling 5,000 copies. The following 2 books sold in similar amounts. Technically, the books were bestsellers, but they weren't going to pay the mortgage. On top of that, I'd just crossed the threshold of 30. Middle age was already nipping at my heels. I needed a plan. I wanted a larger publisher and an American agent who would sell my books into the United States. I took a chapter from one of my previously unpublished horror novels and started a brand new novel. The book began to turn into something that was both literary and horrific. I called it Dust. And suddenly, I felt as though I were channeling Ray Bradbury. I purposefully read his books and the work of W.O. Mitchell and Wallace Stegner, searching for a way to synthesize the 3. I received a Saskatchewan Arts Board grant to work on the novel, which meant that I had the gift of 8 months of financial freedom. And I thank Tommy Douglas for creating the Arts Board oh so many years ago. People often ask why there are so many writers from Saskatchewan. It is the landscape, the communities, and organizations like the Arts Board that have helped grow such a varied crop of writers. When the book was finished, I sent it to HarperCollins, and they accepted it. I felt overwhelmed and excited. Publishing moves very slowly, though, so while I was waiting for the contract, I approached 17 agents, offering them the chance to negotiate the HarperCollins deal. An agent in New York by the name of Scott Trammell accepted. My first step in finding an American publisher had been completed. I must admit that what followed was a whirlwind. Edit letters, rewriting, tour plans. I found out that an editor could help shape your text in a very subtle and perfect way. The ending of Dust was once much darker, and my editor, Marie Campbell, pointed this out, saying, "This is a book about hope." That declaration helped me to craft an ending that resonated with hope. I also discovered that editors take classes in non-specific statements meant to motivate the author. At one point, she told me that there was something missing at the end. What was I to make of that? But when I re-examined the ending of the novel, I agreed and added a whole scene that takes place in the cellar under the evil rainmaker's house. It was the perfect final touch. And the very last editor to look at it was my wife, Brenda Baker, who has a very keen eye for line editing and is particularly good at figuring out what I really meant to say with my prose. When I was finished, I thought the novel was still a little dark and wouldn't appeal to a large audience, but I hoped it would get me a bit more attention than my previous books. And I will admit that I did have a long-term plan for my career. I thought Dust might help me develop a name in the industry. I'd already finished my next book, Tribes, which I hoped would get even more attention than Dust. And I'd started an untitled novel set during World War I. In my long-term vision for my career, I intended for the war book to win the Governor General's Award. Now that may seem egotistical, but at the time I didn't really believe any of my books would win. It was just that I had to aim as high as possible. That way, if I missed, I'd still land somewhere in the vicinity. I was shocked when it was Dust that won the Governor General's Award. So much for my plan. And the success that followed was overwhelming. The invitations to festivals, schools, traveling across the country. This all happened around the same time that I signed a deal with Wendy Lam Books of Random House. So now my novels would be sold in the US. And this is the American version of the cover, obviously without the title pages. The artist was kind enough to send me, I asked him whether I could buy the copy, or the artwork, and he actually just sent me the copy, so I was really, really pleased with that. That's why I'm mentioning him right now. And so the first time in my writing career, I was financially solvent. And because I had already finished my next book, Tribes, I didn't feel the pressure I might have felt were I starting the follow-up book from scratch. Since Dust was not released in the US until 2003, 2 years after the book hit the shelves in Canada, it meant that I was given the chance to have one more crack at rewriting it. The editorial changes were small, mostly adding explanations here and there that would help an American audience understand certain references that were more obvious to the Canadian audience. But again, I learned how an editor could subtly change a book. For Wendy Lam suggested a very small scene, no longer than 2 paragraphs, that shows the reaction of the townspeople after they discover that not all the children would be returning. It is a scene that doesn't appear in the Canadian version, so now I have 2 slightly different versions of the book that exist in the world. I continue to write, on average, a book a year. Tribes was an anthropological study of high school grad week, perhaps my most frightening book. I mean, what could be more frightening than grad week? Then came Megiddo's Shadow, a novel inspired by my grandfather's service in Palestine during World War I. Then Jolted, a magic realism book that explored the life of Newton Starkers, a boy who had a problem. Lightning was attracted to him. I also wrote the junior books, Monsterology and Villainology, and 3 books in the Canadian Chills series. As I look back now, I had followed my muse. From a marketing perspective, this was not a wise choice. If I had written Dust, and then Dust 2, and followed that by another fantastical novel, I may have been living in a mansion now. It was harder for my audience to follow me around every time I switched genres, and this is especially true in the United States. But I had the freedom to do what I wanted, and life seemed endless. That changed when I began to see 40 approaching. I purposely looked at my sales and made a decision to follow my ideas that were aimed at the tweens, which is the group I had sold the most books to. I had made a few notes about a young adult novel set in a futuristic Afghanistan, but I set it aside. Instead, I focused on a story that had been percolating in the back of my brain. I had already been working on a young Sherlock Holmes type project, and I had recently reread The Hunchback of Notre Dame and decided to synthesize the 2. With the series, I was aiming for the upper middle grades to young adult readers. Some people are uncomfortable with the idea of an artist writing to a market. Often there's a vast separation between artistic expression and the market. But I've always attempted to be an artist by writing the best book possible and a marketer once the book is created. Since the beginning, my goal has not been to just be a writer, but to make a living as a writer. The 2 are not incompatible. Just ask Dickens or Shakespeare or Stephen King. You have to find, he's got about 5 mansions, so you have to find which one he's in at what time of the year to actually ask him that question. So I intended to write a series that was part James Bond, but jammed with references to Victorian literature. It would have some depth to it. So, sorry, I lost my place for a second. It would have some depth to it, but also move at a quick pace. And so, The Hunchback Assignments was born. It was a big idea. By that I meant that it would span 7 novels and have an epic storyline. As I began to write it, I became 13 again. That's the only way I can describe it. Oh, it was still work, but in the very early stages of its creation, some inner voice from my childhood was saying, yes, yes, this is exactly the story I wanted. Every science fiction book, action-adventure book, fantasy book, and horror novel that I'd read informed the inner nature of this book. Eventually, it became clear that there would only be 4 books, that it would be more powerful if it was a shorter series. But even now, as I work on the 4th and final book, I am not tired of the world these characters inhabit, or the characters themselves. The series has been well received in Canada, sold internationally, has garnered some film interest, but most of all, I am pleased that it is still making my inner child happy. Let's leave the literary world for a moment and veer towards the electronic world. The two worlds seem to be colliding regularly these days. First, I should point out that my home is Saskatoon, which we lovingly call the Paris of the Prairies. But it's still a long way from Paris, or Toronto, or New York. Perhaps more so than writers in larger centers, I've invested heavily in creating a presence on the internet in order to reach out to the world. That means I'm on Facebook, Twitter, Tumblr, Google+, multiple listservs, and several blogs. I also use Skype and iChat to give virtual presentations to classes in Canada, the US, and even Australia. I have always been a bit of a techno-geek, thanks to Star Trek and Star Wars, so I have pursued this new aspect of the writing life with much gusto. I must be honest and admit, for me, the kid who grew up on science fiction and wielded so many imaginary lightsabers, phasers, and tricorders, carrying an iPod in my pocket and an iPad and Kindle in my computer bag, fills me with a certain sense of glee. And then there's the e-book. Depending on your position, e-books are the white knight of the publishing world, inspiring new readers and unearthing new sources of revenue. Or they are the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, dishing out their sickness and crushing the old order beneath their e-ink stained hooves. There was and is much fear about how e-books have been changing the industry. The publishing world is particularly good at predicting its own downfall, and has been doing so, I imagine, since Gutenberg first went bankrupt printing his Bible. Never has there been such a massive change that impacted the entire industry at once. Yes, distributors have gone bankrupt, or big box stores have changed their buying model, or recessions have cut into profits and changed the distribution model. But the rise of e-books hit all facets of the market at once, leaving no element untouched, including the reader. As an author, it was imperative for me to understand the effects on the industry and, more personally, on my sales and how I would create my next novels. Would books be shorter now? Would they need to have movies embedded inside them? Would they become apps that have games inside the story inside an embedded movie? I needed to dispel my own fears. I couldn't change what was already a reality. If brick-and-mortar bookstores were going to fade away, I personally couldn't stop it. If schools were going to be iPad schools, and some already exist, then I must adapt to that. I must evolve. A part of me relished the idea of taking control of all aspects of publishing. I had once self-published a comic book, which was sold across North America, so I knew I had the skills to publish. I also had many contacts with illustrators, so I wouldn't have any difficulty finding cover artists. I was concerned about the royalty rates offered by publishers for ebooks, and shall I say, entranced by the stories of authors who were publishing ebooks on their own and making gargantuan incomes, some as much as $30,000 to $40,000 a month. It sounded like a pyramid scheme. If it was, I wanted to be on the top. I liked the challenge because I was in the perfect position. I couldn't fail. I was still published by real publishers, which gave me the flexibility to play around with self-publishing. I turned to my Northern Fight series, which sadly had been languishing out of print for several years. It took me about a month of study to learn how to take an electronic file and turn it into an EPUB and into HTML, the code used to create the majority of ebooks sold. Now, my iPod just crashed, just to let you know. Don't panic, it's not going to explode. I have to walk over there and press a button. I'll be right back here in a second. Isn't technology beautiful? It's such a beautiful thing, until it crashes. Anyway, I hired 2 cover artists and uploaded my books. For someone who is used to waiting months to a year for a finished novel to be published, it was an odd experience to suddenly have a book published a few hours after putting it online. I discovered that with the click of a button, you can choose where your books will be distributed, so I was able to e-publish several of my books in foreign countries quite easily. Like any good social networker, I tweeted and Facebooked about my newly available novels. After all, if you tweet it, they will buy it. Very few bought it. I won't go into the details of my successes and failures because I've become a bit of an ebook dork, and I would go on far too long showing you more charts than you would want to see in a lifetime. I will say that the sales were flat for the first 6 months, but recently my novel Dust, which I own the American and UK rights to, climbed as high as number 12 on the horror charts and stayed there for 2 days. That's across all books on Amazon. To have my book briefly outselling my childhood hero Stephen King was, let me say, a rush. Then it dropped off the charts like a meteor. I have so much more to learn about this world of e-publishing. I look at my first 6 books that weren't published and wonder if there is something that is salvageable. Probably not. I would have worked on it before. I also, at some point, would like to write a new book and publish it on my own. What age group it will be for and what topic will inspire it, I can't say. I just like the challenge of it. There are questions that only time can answer. Will the paper-bound book survive? Will mass-market books disappear and only hardcover books live in this brave new world? The real question for me is whether the novel will survive. Will it be replaced by an app that is a mixture of text and video and games? Such hybrid books already exist. It seems to me that the text-only novel will survive and continue to dominate the market. Whether the page is electronic or paper or made of calf skins, the cognitive, emotional, and spiritual reaction is the same. Novels will continue to exist because the story is what matters and will still matter to the readers, not whether you can shake the book and see animated characters pop out. That's fun and absolutely has its place. But at its heart, a novel is a much more personal and private experience than a movie or a game or an app or a combination of all 3. When I talk to writing students, I often try to explain that a novel isn't just words. You're building a relationship with your reader, and relationships are what make us human. I recently had a passionate relationship with The Hunger Games on my Kindle. I devoured that book. It exists in my head alongside all the other books I've read since I was a child. It has no less of a place because it was an ebook. And I believe it would have been diminished if I'd had to stop my reading to watch a video that would somehow further the plot. It has been a long journey from The Hobbit to HTML and ebooks. And now, embarrassingly, I have to walk back to my computer. I only have one more button to push, and I'm done pushing buttons. It has been a long journey from The Hobbit to HTML and ebooks. And there are many journeys and stories ahead of us all. They'll continue to be written down in one format or the other. That much I can guarantee. And we'll continue to read them. To visit the planet Dune, ride inside the Nautilus, or raise a sword and charge after the Horned King. I'm often asked by students, where do stories come from? I think it was all summed up in The Hobbit. We all know that the title of the novel is The Hobbit. But if you turn the page, Tolkien actually gave it a second title, There and Back Again. That is what this world of imagination and real life is all about. Going there and coming back again. And telling everyone about what happened in between. Thank you.
I just want to thank you, Art, very much. That was really interesting. And it made me wonder what this talk would have been like if you hadn't had the images. So that's something to contemplate. But thank you so much for really giving us a tour of your landscape, as it were. Seeing the imaginary Saskatchewan landscape and then following it up with these landscapes of fantasy and science fiction, I think really puts your whole writing life in a wonderful kind of fantastical landscape of its own. I wondered if you would be willing to answer a few questions.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you, and let's open the floor for questions. I didn't quite say that.
Oh. I'll repeat the questions, I promise.
You mentioned that some of your books have gone out of print and gone second life as ebooks. What is the nature of going out of print in the e-universe? Do ebooks go out of print?
Can books go out of print in the e-universe? You know, maybe when the sun has a big flare and it burns out all the e-readers, then they'll officially be out of print. That's one of the things that authors are concerned about when you're looking at contracts, that sort of thing. And when is a book really out of print? When does it stop selling? Technically, if you're looking at an actual contract with a publisher, usually you'll have some kind of clause that will say something like, if only 50 books have sold in the last year, or that's a number I picked out of the air, obviously, then that book is considered out of print. So that's when a book will be out of print. But that's also, the idea of a book never being out of print is one of the things that is really attractive about ebooks, because my books are like for example, the Northern Fright series, or even Dust in the States and the UK, those books were out of print. Nobody was buying them anymore. Nobody was reading them unless they were going to a secondhand bookstore. So those books, essentially, as long as I keep the rights, will be forever in print and forever available. So only if I sold, one book a day or one book a month, over time, as long as I live to be 300, years old, I will eventually be living in a mansion. That's my goal, really.
You mentioned how valuable an editor was in the process of Dust. If you're going to be self-publishing your own work, are you dealing with a freelance editor, or how do you reconcile that relationship?
So just to repeat the question, it's about, basically it's about, will you be using an editor when you're self-publishing? And so far I haven't had to kind of face that question, because all the books I've been self-publishing are books that have already been edited and I've already worked on. I think that, and I did kind of make mention that at some point I'm considering writing a book just on my own, just for me, and it'll intentionally, I think it will be a book for adults that I will publish as an ebook. And the reason I'm saying that is because the books for children are not popular yet as ebooks. They're not, even though you can look on the bestseller charts and you can see the Hunger Games and that sort of thing, it's a very specific kind of market. It has to either seem to have vampires in it or be on that kind of in-between kind of zone. And so the books that I see on all these lists that are selling are the ones that are intentionally for adults. So I'm thinking about that, because I always loved the old science fiction. Anyway, I'm getting away from your question, and anytime you ask a question, I will just start to wander around and trying to remember what the question was. It was about editors, that's what it was. And I think when it comes to that point, I will hire an editor, and what type of editor that will be, I don't know. And I will make sure that somebody goes through my prose. And I think that for me, obviously I've been in the publishing realm for a number of years now, and it's been a very important relationship for me. And also in the whole process of writing a novel, and maybe my editors get sick of this, there's a point where you get into a book and you've been working on it for so long that you just can't see it anymore. And that's the wonderful point when you can send it to an editor and go, hey, isn't it your job now to tell me what's wrong with it? And that's what they do. Or they tell me what's wrong with me. I can't remember which one. Yeah, no, it's my book. That's what they talk about. So I hope that answered your question. Back there.
How are you protecting your books, your ebooks, in terms of copyright? As far as copyright goes, the copyright belongs to me, so they're protected in that sense. But I think maybe, was your question more about how do I protect other people from stealing my books and selling them, which
you can't protect that. And you know, all of my books that I have self-published, they have, if you publish an ebook, there's something that publishers often put on it called DRM, which is, it's a way of locking the book so that you can only, if you buy a Kindle book, you can only read it on a Kindle. If you buy an iPad, you can only read it on an iPad. That DRM, I strip it off. I don't put it on any of my books because to me, I want my book to go onto whatever device people want to read it on. I don't want people to be limited by that. The other reason I strip it off is because, well, I don't strip it off, I don't even put it on. But the other reason I do that is because it takes literally, it takes me, because I've done it with my own books, by the way, it takes me about 3 minutes to take a book that is DRM, that is locked, to press a few buttons, and it is unlocked, and I can put it anywhere, I can put it into any form that I want to. And I am not that smart of a geek. There are a lot more smarter geeks out there. So anybody can do that. So I don't really feel like when you put DRM on a book that you are protecting it from anything. I think the only way to protect it is kind of like the same lesson I think that music has been learning. When the price of CDs were so high, and then suddenly people were all downloading free music, and there was a big panic in the music industry, and they were losing all this money. Well, what really saved them was iTunes. iTunes came along and said, you know what? We're going to make all the songs 99 cents. And everybody, you know, all the music publishers said, no way, we're not going to do that. But when they did that, it made it easy for people to buy it. It was extremely easy, and that saved the music industry, because I think people would have kept on just ripping them off. And the same thing with books. I think books just have to be easily available. And where the question is, what should the price be? And I don't believe, even though I'm selling some of my books for 99 cents and even $1.49 and $2.99, I don't believe those are the real prices I want them to be. Those are the prices I'm giving them now so that they kind of get I guess, recognized in the marketplace, and then gradually I build that price up. So now I've talked so long that I've actually forgotten what I was talking about.
Maybe one more question?
Okay, at the back there.
Thanks. At which point would you say an author should get an agent, and how is it in your situation?
The question is, at what point should an author get an agent? And it's, you know, it is such a different world now. The publishing world is so different than when I started out. When I started out, there was I kind of followed what seemed like a natural pattern, except for all those books getting rejected. I don't recommend that for people. But you know, I was published by a smaller publisher, and I moved up to a larger publisher. And in that process, you know, after I had 4 books published, 4 books published, I got an agent. So an agent was going to look at me, you know, after I had a bit of attention, and then that agent, you know, was able to get me to bigger publishers and out to like publishers all across the world. So that's kind of my process, and I think that process still works today for people. But you know, there are all sorts of different routes that you can go now, and you do kind of need an agent depending on who you want to sell your books to. But I do know, because I'm so much into the ebook world, and I'm on all these different internet boards, like there's a place called Kindle Boards where all the Kindle authors talk to each other. There's a number of them who, because if they want to find a publisher, they've published their own book. They've published it as an ebook. It starts to become popular, starts to get into the bestseller charts, and there are actually agents and publishers out there who are looking at the bestseller charts, seeing who's unpublished, and they'll email them, they'll send them a contract, you know, they'll talk to them. And a number of those people who didn't go, you know, kind of the old style route, they sold a few books, they got the attention, and then they signed a deal with a larger publisher. And except for that, you know, besides them, there is another whole group of authors who are self-publishing on their own, and they don't ever want to be published by a publisher. They just want to do it on their own. And there's like tens of thousands of them. Like there's a lot of them out there. But a certain percentage of them, which I would say is a fairly small percentage, are actually making a living and making a really, really good living at it. So those are the kind of different routes that you could take. And I could never tell you which one is the right one. It really depends on what the book is.
Thanks very much, Arthur.
No.
Thank you very much. Oops. Thank you very much, Jillian, Deirdre, and especially Art. Thank you. That concludes the formal part of this evening's program, but please do join us upstairs. We'll be able to talk to Art there. We're having a reception on the 4th floor up at the Osborne Collection, and there you can enjoy the exhibit Peter Pan, Pirates, Mermaids, and Fairies. So please do join us upstairs. Thank you.